Hey Red Chippers, Fox here with my second hand of the month video. And this hand actually took place at Ho Chunk Casino in Baraboo, Wisconsin. I didn't play a ton of live poker this last month. I had a ton of projects to work on. So I went back to an old hand that I think teaches an important concept called range manipulation. Something my students have told me they find very valuable, so I try to use it more often when I get feedback like that on something. And this hand is an excellent example of the concept. This was not just my first hand at the table, it was my first hand at this card room. It was my first hand of poker ever in Wisconsin. Dealt in an early middle position. It was a 1-2 no limit game. The players were fairly typical for the Midwest. And when I'm the first half an hour or so at a new table, especially at a place I don't regularly play at, tighter than usual, more aggressive than usual when I do play a hand. I'm not taking a lot of risks, and I'm trying to figure out who everybody at the table is. Trying to get, I think that I'm very good with appearance reads. I'm not so good at remembering players. So I think that's made me better at reading people very quickly, because I don't remember these people from last week when I played with them. So I've kind of had to develop that skill. I was dealt jacks in early middle, and I've created this little simulation of a table. Just created PowerPoint slides and altered them as we went through, but I think it works pretty well. We got a fox and a bunch of mutts. Under the gun folded, we had a limp, another fold, and I might raise a little more these days in this spot. Not a lot more. It's a pretty reasonable raise to make it $12 to go. I'm just trying to either win the pot now or at least buy the button, thin my opponent's ranges a little bit so they're easier to play against and have the initiative in the hand, as well as getting money in when I'm ahead usually. I was surprised but not unhappy to see that I had multiple callers. We got 2 calls behind me. The big blind also called, and of course the initial limper called. So we see a $60 pot and see a flop 5 ways. The flop is queen high with 2 hearts. Not my favorite flop, but not actually that bad for me. The problem is, on this board, it's going to be very hard for me to get hand definition if my opponents don't do anything to tell me where they are. And in this case, they didn't. I got 2 checks. So I checked as well. This was an important turning point in the hand where if I bet here and make your standard continuation bet, I probably get called or check raised by a queen. I also get called or check raised by a draw. There are lots of draws out there. And if I get called or check raised, I don't know if I'm facing a set or a draw or a queen or a pair of 9s that's decided to get frisky. Who knows? I decided to keep my options open. In a 5-way pot, the likelihood that somebody was going to call me was fairly high. Half my opponents are behind me. I thought I could leave my options open. If I check and there's a bet behind me and then a raise from somebody else, I can throw my hand away easily. But if not, I can seriously under-rep my hand or over-rep my hand depending on how I play the turn. If there's a bet and I raise the turn, or if it checks to me and I bet and somebody calls me because an 8 fell, they may be paying me off with an 8. There's all kinds of interesting ways to play this if I don't just make a standard flop C-bet. And I felt like this was a good spot to not make your standard flop C-bet, so I checked. It leaves me a lot of interesting options on the turn if it checks through. And it did. Once it checks through, I feel like there's a good chance I have the best hand. If somebody has a better hand than me, it's one of the first 2 players usually. With draws out there, a queen or a set is not going to check it through in one of those last 2 positions behind me. So if I'm beat, it's one of the first 2 positions. Now I get to find out kind of what that looks like. If it checks through to me here, I'm definitely going to bet it. I'm probably going to bet $45 to look strong here. if it checks through to me, but it doesn't. The big blind bets, and he only bets $20. That doesn't usually look like a set to me. It usually, and the big blind is less likely to have a set than one pair. He didn't need as big, as much of a hand to call with. Then we get an insta call from the early position limper. The big blind bet out nearly instantly, which tells me he was intending to check raise the flop. The board didn't change. He didn't have to assess how that 9 hit him, which means the 9 didn't change his hand at all. It's very unlikely that anyone bets a draw that way. First of all, the insta-bet with a draw into a field of 4 people on the turn is a little strange. The bet of a third of the pot on the turn is a little strange, out of position with a draw. This looks like a hand to me. It looks like either a queen or a 9. Doesn't look like a monster. If this was a set that had been hoping to check raise, I think usually what you see here is a bet of, say, $45, $50, $60. So this looks like a one-pair hand to me. And if it's a one-pair hand, because of the way I've played it, I could probably bluff them out. I was the pre-flop raiser. I'm a new guy. I'm sure they paid attention to the fact that I was the pre-flop raiser. Then I checked behind on the turn, and if I raise now, it looks like I have a set of queens. It may also look like I have kings or aces or ace-queen, but it's going to look scary either way. The instant call from the early position player might mean a hand like queen 10 or ace 9 suited, but it very likely means 2 hearts. So I decide to raise here. I will almost certainly blow the players out behind me. And they checked after being checked to by a bunch of people on a draw-heavy board, so they don't have anything or they have draws, and if they have draws, I'd like to punish them now. But they're very unlikely to have any kind of made hand after behaving that way on the flop. Checking behind with this many people in the pot, a made hand's always going to be afraid of draws and they're always going to bet. So I'm not too worried about the players behind me. I'm more considering the players on my right, and do they have the hands I think they have, the kinds of ranges I think they have. I don't think anybody has a monster here. Nobody's played it like a monster. I do think it's very likely that the caller has a draw and the better has a made hand. That's the way this hand plays out. That's the way it makes sense to me. And on this board, that's the way it looks. So I decided to raise it up here and see if I could blow out. If in fact the big blind has a made hand, if I raise to $50 or $60 here, I'm often going to blow him out because he's going to be afraid of the guy behind him. He probably doesn't have much of a made hand, and he's going to be afraid of both me and the guy behind him, and he's likely to fold for a fairly small raise. A pot size raise here would be like $140, but a normal size raise to maybe 65 would probably do the trick. In this case, because this was a conservative environment, people tend to make smaller bets in more rural areas in the Midwest, unless they're those I protect my hand guys who will overbet things. And I also didn't want to invest a ton of money when I might not have the best hand. I may have made the mistake of betting too small here with my raise and not getting, it's possible that I could have ended up being called by the big blind and should have maybe made a little bit bigger raise and committed a little better to it. But it served my purpose. So I raised to $55. I know that this is going to confuse much of the table. They're going to read me for probably having a very strong hand. A set of queens, a set of nines, aces, kings, ace, queen. People are going to read me for that kind of range here. They're going to be afraid of a big hand because of the way I played it. It works and chases out the players behind me and the big blind, which is great news for me. And then a snap call from the original limper. When he snap calls, I think he's got 2 hearts or he's got 10 jack almost all the time. And since I have 2 jacks in my hand, I think he's got 2 hearts almost all the time. Now, it could be that he's a loose player and he's got a 9, or he's playing a queen very strangely. It's hard to say. But most of the time, he's got 2 hearts. A very safe turn card, or river card for me. This river card is all I could possibly ask for. He checks to me. There's a case to be made for a big bet here, turning my hand into a bluff now that I've seen real weakness from him. The question is he going to fold king-queen or queen 10. And I think if he's come this far, he might not fold those hands. I think that this is not the time to turn my made hand into a bluff. That is a thing I do in cash games. I just don't think this is the right spot for it. But it's important to consider every option. So does betting small here make sense for value? Maybe. It might actually. And if I made a real mistake in this hand, it's that if I'm going to trust my reads this much, I may want to trust them to the point where I bet $65 here and try to get paid off by, a pair of sixes or a 10-9 or something. But I don't think there's hardly anything in his range that's going to call me. The only thing that calls me really is two hearts that includes a 9. That's like the majority of the time that he calls me, and there's just not nearly as many of those combos as there are lots of other things, including hands like king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10, that now are beating me. Or the small possibility that he had, ace 4 of hearts and just decided to check the nuts or the second nuts now that we've made it to the river in a big pot and try to get all my chips. Every once in a while that happens. So I decided I should just check behind here. I just don't think he has a 9 with the 9 of hearts often enough. Now, if this was a queen of clubs, 5 of hearts, deuce of hearts board, then the whole hand plays out differently. I'm very happy checking here, and I may not have even bet the turn or raised the turn because I would have been afraid that somebody has both the top pair and the flush draw, and they've got me drawing really, really thin, and they're never going to fold. But because of the way the board was set up, where the flush draw had the top card, somebody can't have both a flush draw and top pair, so I can usually blow out the top pair and just go against the flush draw, and I'm a 2-1 favorite, and I've got people putting dead money in there because they folded the turn. So all those things work out well for me because of the way this board was set up. If the board's set up differently with the queen of clubs, 5 of hearts, deuce of hearts, then now I've got a lot tougher decisions to make. And in that spot, I might have actually bet the flop because I don't have as many options when the turn comes. Or I might have just folded the turn and just given up on it and said I only have $12 in this pot. I don't need to fight over it anymore. But with this board, definitely it was correct to raise, as long as you know your players. I know that these guys in Wisconsin are just like the guys that I play with in Minnesota and that I've played with in Michigan and the Dakotas. And, I've played a lot in the Midwest, and I recognized the types of players I was playing with in this room. And so I was comfortable playing with them even though it was my first hand. If there are wild cards in the hand or you don't know this type of player well, it's much harder to make these plays until you've spent some time at the table. You can't make this kind of play the first hand at the table like I did here. But if you know the players well, this works great. And it being my first hand at the table, some of this works better because it's scarier. So I checked behind. He said, I have nothing. I believed him, so I showed my jacks. He showed me ace 7 of hearts for the busted flush draw. Another question may come up here, would I have called a big river bet? What if this guy decided, after he missed his draw, to fire in 150 on the river? I think I have to call him because the only hand I'm really afraid of is ace 4 of hearts. I can beat everything else. This is a perfect bluff catcher spot if he does decide to make a big bet here, because it would be very odd for a set to slow play here. It would be very odd for a pair of threes to still be in the hand. With the draws out there, a set would have shown me some more action somewhere else, usually. You have to know your player. Can't always rely on that being true, but very rarely in more conservative areas, places where people are more conservative with money, is somebody just slow playing a set for 2 streets and then jamming into you on the river with it when there's draws on the board. That's just a very rare thing, and I wouldn't have expected that here. If I was playing in Northern California, this would be another whole different pot where my raise size pre-flop would have been bigger, or I would have limped. because I would have known if I raise, I'm going to get at least 4 callers. And I'd be playing everything very differently against players who tend to be more wild and more aggressive and fold a lot less in those games. That's why they're more profitable a lot of times than the Midwest games, but those California games are also very hard to read. You can't read your opponents as well if they're maniacally aggressive. It's hard to do. I think this hand illustrates how important hand reading and having faith in your reads can be. And I think it illustrates how important range manipulation is. How you can promote your hand to being the best hand, what we call what in Omaha 8 we call a promo raise. You can make your hand be the best hand and keep in the draws. That's something you don't see a lot in Hold'em. You don't see it done very often, but it's very profitable. And in this spot, it probably made me $100. I would have had to just bet the flop or fold the turn or just call $20 on the, I don't know, whatever I would have had to do. If I couldn't make that play, it would have been way less profitable than this, and it probably made me $100 here. It's something that I managed to do maybe once a session or once every other session if I'm playing shorter sessions. It's not a super common thing, but it does probably, this concept, when it works, it's fairly profitable, and overall, given that it works a lot more than it fails, probably makes me $100 a week. It takes some work, some time to think about this. It takes a lot of being very comfortable looking at boards and knowing how likely it is that your opponents have different things. Applying some combinatorics to that can help. But it's a valuable concept. If you can chase out the made hand that beats you and keep in the draw, that's super valuable. When you can play your hand in odd ways that surprise people, that's also very valuable. And the big blind, in fact, after I showed my jacks, told me that he folded a queen. So it worked perfectly in blowing out the made hand. And it also, in this case, my opponents all decided that I was really good at poker. Usually your opponents would think you were an idiot, but these guys just knew just enough to decide that this must mean that I was good. And then I got a lot of respect from then on for the rest of the game. So I didn't have to show down the nuts all the time. When I made the nuts, I didn't get paid as much, but I was able to steal some extra pots. And it certainly it shows people a way of playing that you're not typically playing. So in most games, certainly if I do this in Vegas, 6 or 7 of the players at the table are going to think that I'm an idiot because of it. They're not going to understand what happened. And so it's really great for table image. It can be very good for that. And it can make you extra money there. When I'm regularly playing at one room, like this time last year, I was playing at the Wynn every day. And the players at the 2-5 at the Wynn definitely treated me differently if they'd seen me make this kind of play, because even most of the headphone grinders don't make this kind of play. This is usually a play that you see 5-10 or bigger, and I haven't played a lot of no limit above 10-20, so I don't know, but my guess is that you see this kind of play more frequently in those bigger games. I hope this was valuable. A lot of my students have told me they really like this hand and some of the ways that it teaches the concept. So I hope it was good for you, and I'll be back next month with another hand history of the month. Here's how you can get in touch with me if you have questions about this hand, or you can post about it on the Red Chip forums, where people are usually very helpful.